Salutations, listeners, and welcome back to Glitch Bottle, the podcast where we uncork the uncommon in magic, mysticism, and the generally misunderstood. I'm your host, Alexander F., and today we are so excited to welcome back to the show David Chaim Smith. David Chaim Smith is an esoteric cartographer, an author, a mystic, and today we are going to be talking with Dave about esoteric cartography as a practice and how it came to be and what the components of esoteric cartography are. So, Dave, as always, it is so great to welcome you back to the show. Let's just start with the most important and best question, which is, what is esoteric cartography?
Hi, Alex. Esoteric cartography is a practice that comes out of a general, larger context of mystical inquiry. And in order to answer the question, what is esoteric cartography, you gotta look at the source of where practices in the mystical register come from. Generally, they either come from a tradition where the tradition is its own authority, like a revealed truth, like in a religion or whatnot, and Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism. I would exclude Buddhism from that, but these religious traditions are the authority for the esoteric or mystical branches. So you're always drawing forth from some authority that is bigger than yourself. The other possibility is you're in a lineage where the realization of someone is passed down from mouth to ear over a period of time and ultimately reaches you. Neither one of those applies to me. I don't have a source which is my authority. I'm like an explorer, right? And esoteric cartography is a process of mapping out the exploration, whereas the discoveries that I make along the way are recorded somehow. So although I'm a mystical practitioner and there's mystical aspects to my practice, the outer form of it that people will see, which is what we're going to talk about today, is just this idea of calculating the registration of what I'm discovering as I'm going along. I don't claim to be anything or act on behalf of anything in terms of some sort of authority, spiritual authority. I'm not wielding that sword. I'm just simply exploring territory for myself and presenting my data. So that's a little different than being a mouthpiece for a religion or a tradition or a lineage or something like that. Although I have those influences, I'm not involved in those I'm not fronting those activities. You know, the only activity I'm fronting, we're going to see pictures of today. So that's something that people maybe never heard of before.
That's lovely. And I think, listeners who might be hearing this for the first time would love to know, how were you initially involved in this? How did you get started in this? As you said, you have no source of authority. You are an explorer, esoteric cartographer. How did you get started in this?
Well, I've been doing this for 30 years and I'm 62 years old, so it's almost half my life I've been doing this. And in 1996, I had been involved for, quite a few years in the Western esoteric tradition from the standpoint of Hermetic Kabbalah. And I was a member of the mainstream occult orders that everybody knows that are sort of post-Golden Dawn, right? They're all more or less similar, so I don't need to delineate the vicissitudes of that. Everybody knows what that is. And I felt like I hit a wall. And that wall we're going to talk about today. I wanted to go further than what I was finding. And this is not a reflection on those orders. It's a reflection on my experience of them. I felt like I hit a wall. So 1996 to 2006, I decided to stop everything. I was a visual artist throughout the 80s and was involved in various spiritual things. I decided to scrap all of it, meaning no more visual art, no more exploration of what I was doing, which is sort of a version of what I'm doing now. But I thought, look, whatever this is not working. So I'm going to go back to basics and become a student, even though I'd been involved for years in these things, and just find people to study with and work my ass off with study and practice. And I did that for 10 years. And at the end of 10 years, without wanting to, in 2006, something started to happen that I hadn't planned on, because I thought I was just going to dump art and being my own, like being an author or whatever it is, writing books and making diagrams. I thought I would never do that again. But it came back because of this 10 years of inquiry that I was involved in. And it came back in this really unusual form that became what I call esoteric cartography. So the image that we're looking at here on the screen is from the very beginning of this process in 2006. And it started from necessity. The image on the right here is called a Shavisi diagram. Shavisi means put before you, or I have put before me, right? And what is put before you are divine names in Hebrew, which are the structural support for all of Kabbalah. Since I was studying Kabbalah with various vantage points that are unusual, highly esoteric sources, Kabbalistic sources within the Jewish world, I encounter diagrams like this all the time. The diagram on the right that we're looking at is printed. It's in a book. It's a Kabbalistic prayer book. It's a section that an Orthodox Jew who's involved in Kabbalah would look at every day while they're doing their prayers, and they would take these little ventures to do these internal practices that manipulate divine names that are connected to Sfirot on the tree of life in complex ways. And you look at the diagram and you do the practices that you know internally while you're looking at the diagram. So the Shavisi diagram, like this printed one, is a contemporary example of it. Like Orthodox Jews who do this esoteric stuff, they would see things like this every single day. This is just a contemporary version of it, nothing special. Now, I don't believe in the creator God of Judaism. I'm not a theist, nor have I ever believed in their religious mythology, nor have I ever cared about it, but I'd say it's a little bit more than neutral. It's on the negative side. I don't like it. But when I studied with Orthodox Jews, it was to learn highly esoteric material that only they could provide, because the Western esotericists didn't have a terribly detailed accounting of the Kabbalistic tradition. They had sort of a generalized version of it in Hermetic Kabbalah. So I had to go to the source. So you go to the Jews, you go to the guys with the black hats and the beards. And luckily, they liked me more or less enough that I had some really good teachers. And when you go to somebody for help, you don't say, look, I'm starving, but I don't like the kind of food you're offering, so I'm going to get real picky and, be a pain in the ass about what you... No, you do it their way. So I went to them. I wore a black hat. You walk in their house, you show respect, right? And in the process, I saw diagrams like this, and I thought, most of the stuff these guys are talking about doesn't suit my interests. So I thought, I got to make my own Shavisi diagram to sum up the practices that I actually want to do, eliminating all the stuff that's irrelevant to me. And the diagram on the left that we're looking at here, it's one of my own Shavisi diagrams that I made out of necessity for my own practice. What you see is like usually a big divine name with permutations graphically superimposed on it. And one common form that you see all the time is the form of the menorah, which is basically the tree of life, and I could show you how if you want to know the sphirot or the different parts of the menorah. And there are prayers, in particular one prayer called Ana B'Koach that Orthodox Jews say, but I never said Ana B'Koach, so I don't need those associations. So I put in my own that were related to these weird things that I was finding. And I didn't have to answer to anybody or show my diagrams to anybody. So I just made them as full and complex and weird as I wanted. So the difference between my Shavisi on the left and this sort of conventional printed Shavisi on the right, if an Orthodox Jew saw this, they would think it was crazy. Like, what's going on there? So that's where I started in 2006. And that's where it took off from.
Excellent. I'm thinking of the quote from William Blake that I think you so wonderfully, internalized, which is, I must either create my own system or be enslaved by another man's. And I think that is that similar with these diagrams? You were just like, hey, this isn't quite hitting the octaves on the harpsichord of my consciousness. I need something else that can resonate better with, and you wanted to create your own system.
Well, in order to do that, you have to pretty much give in to a bunch of assumptions that will free you. And one of them is that you know what you're doing. You're giving up the authority of systems, because when you have a system that becomes your authority, you could always fall back on the system to fill in the gaps of what you don't know. And for someone in a religion, for example, or in a lineage, or even in an order, you have the group consciousness and its history and the great realizers attached to it who are so much bigger than little tiny you. And once you sever that cord, you're on your own. And that's a kind of a scary place to be. So there's only two options there for most minds. One is, I am a wretched wiggly worm on the ocean depths. I know nothing. I'm a worthless whatever. And then you can't do anything. Or I'm a fucking genius. I'm great and powerful. Both of those extremes will sink you, basically. So what you have to do to free up exploration is start out with the premise, I don't know. And I seek to find out. And you're fighting fantasy and grandiosity and also self-deprecation. So you're walking that thin line where your sincerity is the only thing you got, really. And to be the William Blake character that you're talking about, where you make your own system, what a unworkable thing to try to do, because you're going to make your own system in the face of hundreds of years of people who are way beyond you, who have made these perfect things, and you have the audacity to come in and say, I will not be a slave to another man's system. What kind of balls do you think you have at that point? So you're doing this crazy thing. You're doing this impossible thing, and you're working within that impossibility. So you better be humble, but you can't buckle at the same time. So unless you come through with the goods, meaning something really unusual, you got to stop. You can't take that approach and keep going forever unless you're coming through with the goods. So what I'm going to show you today is what I came up with that gave me enough positive reinforcement to myself that I thought, well, I can work here.
Absolutely. And I think as we begin to go through these incredible esoteric cartographical images, I think listeners, especially, we will be discussing, and Dave, I'm very much looking forward for you sharing the tonalities, the resonances with traditional esoteric symbolism and the esoteric cartographical use of and interpretation of these, I think, is absolutely wonderful for people to hear. So if you'd like, we can certainly.
Yeah, keep going. Next
Okay.
image.
You got it. So yeah, tell us about this one from 1653 and then any context around this.
Yeah, I'm going to show some historical examples along with my own work, and where I have shown a historical example, I've provided a reference and a date so you get some idea what the history of the tradition's like and how I'm operating within it. The only one that I haven't labeled that way is the image on the right of the screen here, because it's a very commonplace image. This is just from one of the OTO's books, but the correspondences are not specific to that system for the most part. There's a couple of little substitutions. This is a diagram of the tree of life with all the correspondences that Western magicians tend to use. And the basis of it, aside from the astrological material, are the connective paths associated with the tarot trumps. So you get the tarot trumps, and there's 22 connective paths here. And then the spherote, which would be the number cards of the tarot, in 4 registers corresponding to 4 worlds or 4 contexts of reality. There's your tarot. So the tarot is kind of like a summary of the tree in pictorial form. Now, the thing about that is that it answers the question posed by the Sefer Yetzirah of what is reality? Well, the Sefer Yetzirah provides 32 paths of wisdom. 22 letters, 10 sphirot, 32 paths. The addendum to most versions of the Sefer Yetzirah that you find contains a supplementary text called the 32 Paths, which is much later than the Sefer Yetzirah. Sefer Yetzirah comes from late antiquity, but the 32 Paths text that labels each path, each of the letters, each of the sphirot, that's probably from after the Renaissance at some point, maybe the 16th or 17th century, I'm not sure. But the reason why we have the tarot presented this way is all Sefer Yetzirah. So the summation of this, the model for this historically, was synthesized from sources that were found by Athanasius Kircher and published in 1653. And we see Kircher's tree on the right here. The correspondences are more or less the same as the contemporary one. So the path attributions are all the same. There's other things in here like angelic names. There's not so much astrological correspondence, but basically the framework of the 32 path as a style of the way to present the tree was codified in 1653. Didn't really change all that much. When I was in mainstream occult orders, this was the attribution system that you got, and nobody budged from it. And as you could see, the path of Aleph connects Keter and Chokhmah, the path of Bet connects Keter and Bina. So there's your fool, there's your magician, and basically the letters go in logical order from the top to the bottom. It's basically not really mapping out the functions of the letters. It's just delineating them logically, starting at the top. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So I always kind of questioned the path placement of the letters because so much is made via the tarot of what these connective paths were doing. It's not like I didn't like it or there was a problem with it. I just thought this is limited. And the mentality in Western esoterica pertaining to correspondences in general can be really quite rigid, meaning you get a correspondence system and it gets frozen on the tree. And there's no play to it where you try different solutions. It's almost like this model of reality is the one we're using. It's the only one, and you have to adapt to it. It's not that it's wrong. It's just one of infinite solutions. So the rigidity with which the tree is used in conventional mainstream contexts never sat right with me. And part of my reason for esoteric cartography is to seek out solutions to this. And what I found in the Jewish world is there are a million variations, not just one. So this tree that goes back to Kircher, for a certain community of people, was all that they had, or all that I saw that they had, or all that was presented to me. And adapting to it was locked in the rituals, in the magic. And back then, my interest was magical rather than mystical when I first started out. So seeking to go beyond this, and I'm not criticizing it, it's a fine system, but there's so much more out there. And I'll show you what I mean with the next image. Now, here on the left is a classic tree diagram from the 14th century. Now, that's old, right? 14th century. That goes back before the Renaissance. That goes back before what most people know as Hermeticism, which is Renaissance Hermeticism. There's ancient Hermeticism and there's Renaissance Hermeticism. Renaissance Hermeticism really reached its fullness in the 17th century, after the Renaissance. So this goes back before the tree was really even a twinkle in the eye of a Western esotericist. And if you look at the diagram, the first thing you got to notice is there aren't 22 connective paths here. This tree has a totally different structure. There's 15 paths. What the hell? What's going on? It's not the 32 paths anymore. So when I saw images like this, which are really hard to find, by the way, the first thing that I realized is what's going on with the letters is extremely fluid, but they're always 10 sphirot. So the 10 sphirot are the structural basis in which the letter play is poured. So the 32 paths is a much larger issue than just that static, rigid presentation that Kircher gave us in 1653. So if you really want to understand the tree structurally, it's through the sphirot that you understand it. And that was really my thing. The play of letters and the divine speech is another style of practice. And in Kabbalah, there was always really a little bit of a distinction between those Kabbalists who concentrated on letter work and those who concentrated on the structural work of the sphirot and how it formed a picture of reality. So this 14th century tree on the left here alludes to a different way of working, where one could have a structural flexibility and exploration could be possible. Because once you see a tree like this, once you found this, you probably found a whole bunch of other ones that are all different. And then you realize this is a range of mapping. This isn't one framework that is the truth. So that was like a huge gap being filled when I found the history of Kabbalah being presented this way. On the right here is one of my diagrams, and it's sort of structurally very similar to the 14th century one. You have this giant ferret in the middle, the supernals on top, and then it pours down to become many forms of phenomena on the bottom. So you have a supernal essentiality. You have the display, ultimately, which is your Malkut, and then Tiferet becomes the galvanizing heart of the process that allows that essentiality to be expressed in all of its fullness in a moving way, in a way that has to do with motion and process of formation. So if you link them all together, this is reality expressing itself in innumerable ways and paths of variation, and its essence can be explored. So to make that a rigid thing or a small thing, it sort of defeats the whole purpose. So that's where I'm coming from in terms of Sphirot and in terms of breaking with the tradition that I started out with.
Yes, it's lovely. There seems to be a dynamism there. You are exploiting a malleability in the different presentations of the Tree of Life, and I just love that, where you are, and tell me if this is somewhat accurate, you are effectively shattering the petrification that so many modern esoteric presentations have of the Tree of Life and how to practice, for example. And you're saying, not only going back to earlier pre-Renaissance sources, but you're also, and I'd love for you to talk about this with this image or the next image, but I think, Dave, one of the amazing things is you are an explorer and an esoteric cartographer, and you look at previous material and you explore it for yourself in esoteric cartography. And I'd love to discuss how you appropriate historical images and make them literally what you discover as an esoteric cartographer.
Well, in order to answer to that, I would have to say a little bit more about my background. When I stopped just being a member of these orders in a Hermetic Kabbalah style of inquiry, Western esoteric tradition, the first thing I did is I tried to find all the root sources of everything that they had, the Hermetic Kabbalists, the occultists, magicians that I was affiliated with. Where did that come from? So I found Corpus Hermeticum, I found Jewish texts, I found Nag Hammadi Library, those types of sources. But very, very quickly, I found that once you're talking about the roots of Kabbalah, the roots were more mystical than magical. The magical was an adaptation of it, but really it was a path that sought realization of the essence of reality, which in a theistic tradition would be God, union with the divine. Once I started going into an exploration of that, my scope widened to include other forms of inquiry other than ones that were obviously directly connected to what I was doing. And I began to explore non-dual traditions, especially because one component of the Western esoteric tradition, which is tangential to magic, is the study of alchemy, alchemical transformation, which is the distillation of essentiality from form, right? Once I started looking into alchemy from the Western perspective, I found other solutions in what we can call spiritual alchemy in the West. Jacob Boehme, for example, hugely influential to me. Robert Flood, which we will see an image from in a minute. Dionysius Freyr wrote commentary and did diagrams commenting on Boehme's tradition, but also non-dual traditions from beyond European sources, from the Middle East, from Iran, and Syria, and also the territorial border between the East and the West, which today would be considered Afghanistan and Pakistan, which was in the 13th century a hotbed of mystical inquiry. So once I found these non-dual alchemical sources, I started investigating tantric traditions and traditions of spiritual realization that had to be somehow reconciled with the mystical traditions of the Kabbalistic stuff. And certain branches of these traditions connected and other ones didn't. When I found the ones that actually connected and found living lineages, not dead systems that we found fragments of, but living lineages that were actually still around teaching this stuff, I was there. So there were two very specific sources that I went to. One was the source of Vajrayana, and the group that I was learning from was sort of a synthesis of Hindu Advaita and Buddhist Vajrayana via Dzogchen. And then there was the mystical devotional system of Kabbalah that is practiced by Hasidic Jews. So during my 10 years of training, I was putting on a black hat and going and studying with Hasidim in Borough Park, Brooklyn, and in the same week, getting on a plane and going to a tantric hermitage in the Midwest and studying with tantrikas. So ultimately, for 10 years, I was just taking in this information with no intention of making any kind of a system out of it. But the system kind of made itself, because these things deeply, deeply connected with each other. And we're not talking about a broad, generalized view of these things. We're talking about very specific lineages doing very specific things that I was interested in. And through my interest, the wires could be connected and soldered together. And that's what happened, because once I found these connections, because of the way that I have to work things out, I mapped them in notebooks. And that notebook work became these diagrams. And just like I started out having to make a shavisi for myself because I wanted to do these practices, and these images that I needed didn't exist, I had to make them to use them. It was the same thing with my notebook work. These connections that I was finding where the systems interpenetrated each other, they had to be coalesced into notation for me to really understand them. So the act of making these notations, these maps, caused me to understand them deeper. That's just the way that my mind works. I have to work it out graphically.
That's absolutely wonderful. And I think as we go through these images, people will see the different emphases, the different highlights of the facets of contemplative mysticism that you're calling out there. If you'd like, Dave, I can also move to the next image, and
yes,
we can discuss. Go. Absolutely, because I think these are all very fascinating. And yeah, tell us about this image. What are the, instead of focusing on, a very specific part of one part of the image, tell us about the function of these images. What are we looking at here?
Well, the function of this image is alchemical. So what I'm doing here is taking my background with the Tree of Life and trying to explain an alchemical structure where transmutation will take place. And both of these images are mine. The image on the right, I'll get to in a minute, but it's explained by the image on the left. The image on the left is just sort of a bare bones linear diagram of the central column of the tree with the divine names of and the names of the Sefirot that pertain to what was generally known as the middle pillar. And on top it says Atzmut, which means essence. That's what's ultimately extracted from the alchemical vessel of the inquiry of practice. So the entire array takes place in the shape of an alchemical vessel in a very stylized way. The belly of the vessel is the circumstance of the display of reality. That's your Malkut. That's reality. That's the world. And what is drawn from that display has these various registers that reveal its essence. And ultimately, what overflows and can be poured out of the mouth of the vessel is the essentiality of that display, which is nothing other than the display. These are not two things. Essence and appearance are a single unity, the same continuum. However, the essence hides within itself, within the appearance of reality, and that's where the human mind goes into its habit patterns and misses the essence entirely. thinking the world is just a superficial, fragmented, random, chaotic presentation of a very limited view of time and space and matter and idea. So what spiritual alchemy really seeks to do is confront the habit patterns that cause the mind to be hidden within itself, within its experience of the world, and draw forth its essence so that it can ultimately be realized and seen, beyond the limitations that characterize the ordinary mind's function. So the alchemical vessel is you. It's not only you as a body mind, it's consciousness in the context of you. And it's not only you, it's all human expressions, which you are one of. So the alchemy that we're talking about here is the alchemy of realization. Now, the same middle pillar correspondences that you see in this alchemical vessel on the left are in the diagram on the right. But something very unusual happened around 2007, 2008 as I was making these diagrams. I really don't even know how to explain how this happened. It just happened. The diagrams started coming to life. The diagrams started to become sort of breathing organisms on paper. And this happened because what I was connecting to was the etheric presence that I was calling forth by my inquiry. So what I allowed to happen, I didn't make it happen. It was just not obstructed by me, was that this etheric presence started to pour forth in the form of what's called biomorphic imagery. The word biomorphism is bio meaning life, morph meaning form. So living forms. And these living forms had both organic and geometric aspects. On the geometric side, there were circles and lines and points and relationships of a geometry that was structural, that formed compositions. But within those compositions, the organic aspects, which are curved and curvilinear, started to swell and upsurge and spill out and overflow in a way that was held into order by the geometry. So the organic aspect just spills out into chaos, but the geometry structures it into an orderly set of patterns. So this dialogue between organic and geometric aspects is one etheric field of inquiry that is both inner within the mind and outer in the universe or world of the mind. And what was happening both in my own practice of contemplative mystical inquiry and in these diagrams was that what started out to be a technical diagram now came to life sort of almost like a living temple in which the mind, once the diagram had been constructed, the mind could go in there and the thing is alive because the material is alive. And it's very much like my early explorations in magic, when the magician seeks to evoke spirit intelligence or even an angelic form. How does this really happen? Well, Eliphas Levi talked about this in his great work, Transcendental Magic, about this universal plastic mediator, he calls it, which is the etheric substructure of all inner and outer relationships. So it's through that etheric medium that the mind of the magician, in its capacity to evoke and invoke, essentially to call, draws forth these intelligences because your mind, the magical mind that calls, and the entity that is called share this etheric field together, that it's inherent to both. So if there is a link, the magical process can be expressed because of the acknowledgement of that link. That link is what makes the technical diagram come to life in esoteric cartography. So what you're seeing on the right is basically a diagram come to life. If you want to see it just structurally, that's what the diagram on the left is.
That's incredible. Thank you for sharing that, because it's so powerful. And I'm just taking some notes here about how this was coalesced into notation for you. It had to be that way for you to express it. But this living temple, this vesselistic shape being infused with this organic aspect. I think this is wonderful, Dave. And I think let me go to the next image here, because I think this is another octave in your notation. Can you tell us about this balance of the skeletal structure and the organic living temple? What are we looking at here?
Around 2008, as soon as these technical diagrams started to come to life, I already had enough pretty detailed, sophisticated technical information Kabbalistically in the diagrams that technically they were what I needed to work with, all of the elements, because I had some rare opportunities to learn with Orthodox Jews a degree of detail in Kabbalah which I hadn't even dreamed of. Like, I was lucky enough to get that stuff because it's not translated, all that stuff. I had to learn it orally from guys with hats and beards, basically. And that's the structural basis of this. But what had happened, what had ripened by around 2008, is the diagrams had come to life to such a degree that I could then let the genie out of the bottle, let it really spill out. And one way that it spilled out was the making of many triptychs. And what was interesting about the triptych form is that I could have one piece with different statements being made, which are the three parts of the triptych, very much like the triptychs of a Western Renaissance painting functioned as altarpieces. And many of the great altarpieces that you learn about in Western art history had a sort of an implied narrative, but it wasn't an illustration. Something was being investigated beyond the narrative, the illustrated story. So you had a illustrated story of, scenes from the life of Jesus, for example. But what makes great art more than just a mere illustration is things were being communicated that couldn't be summed up just by a narrative explanation. So what I decided to do, since they were coming to life, is allow that to work on the esoteric level. So what you see in this image that you're looking at here are all the things that I mentioned. You have an alchemical aspect. You have an aspect which still functions like a Shavisi diagram. For example, look at that middle panel here. There's one divine name, Yud He Vav He, being presented. That's a Shavisi. But woven into it are all of these esoteric formulas. And we see on the one on the right a specific esoteric formula of what's called a Yehud practice, a unification practice in Kabbalah that is done internally, the same way those printed diagrams in the prayer books give you the divine names to do an internal practice. You could do it from this as well. So it's functional, but yet it's teeming with this biomorphic etheric activity that allows it to really breathe and become like a living thing. So they're all of these levels intertwined with each other. They're inseparable from each other. And what you get is something that is multi-dimensional that you could use as part of your practice, but yet it presents a vision. And as a visionary statement, it does something that I never saw before. So once I started making work like this, one of the first things that I realized is I've been involved in this at that point for a long time, and I never saw this before. So I got to follow this through, because what I'm sensing here is the making of a type of work that doesn't exist yet. So I felt like the discovery aspect was enough for the purpose of my life. That the more I discover here, the more I'm furthering the basic tenets of what I want to be practicing. So I'm not deviating from that. But yet a type of exploration is coming out of it that I feel a responsibility to. And what I realized, because I had been a practitioner for so many years, is I can't make this about me. Meaning, I don't want to be an artist. Art is, for the most part, stupid in contemporary society. It's a dull-witted self-aggrandizement that usually veers into either personal propaganda or gimmicks. I mean, just look at contemporary art. Would you want to be part of that? No. As far as I'm concerned, I left that. I mean, I was an artist in the 80s in the clown show of New York, but the whole thing about it is I didn't want any association with that at all. So what I had to do was say, rather than be an artist and make statements of personal expression, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to serve this with the whole of my life and give my life over to it, not as a product of me. It's the other way around. I'm not the boss. The work is the boss, and I will serve that exploration. But yet, just like I said before, there was no spiritual authority. There was no authority whatsoever. So on one level, it was a totally anarchistic activity, which had no authority, no hierarchy, no structure. I was on my own, drifting in the space of discovery. And to live a life of discovery and exploration is very different than what a religious person does, and is actually very different from what most occultists do. So esoteric cartography has a very odd position in the scheme of things, because you're an outsider. You know, the universities don't want you. The religions don't want you. The traditions, even esoteric traditions themselves, don't want you. Why do they don't want you? You don't want them. So what was the a recourse for me? I went into retreat, right? And living a life of retreat basically means, well, it ultimately meant I'm not going to leave my house. I'm just going to work. I'm just going to serve the work.
And I think it's so important for, I know myself, and I'm sure the listeners, to hear about this evolution, this permission of, hey, I don't fit into any categories. I don't fit into any, and it's not because I'm trying to make it about me. It's because of this thing pouring into you, into the vessel of yourself as an esoteric cartographer. And I think it might be reflected here as well, because you opened with, Dave, the Tree of Life and the menagerie of different presentations of the Tree of Life. So can you tell us, what are we looking at here?
Well, we see a historical example of a certain configuration of the Sphirot from 1728. It's from a very rare edition of the Chaim, which is basically some summary of Lurianic Kabbalah that every Orthodox Jew in the world uses, the Chaim. And that's on the right. And on the left is my own presentation of these configurations. And what we see here, we don't have enough time to really go into, but it's the idea of the question. For those of your listeners who know something about the tree The Sefer Yetzirah says they're 10 and not 9, 10 and not 11 sfirot. But yet there's this 11th sphira, which is called dot. Dot means knowledge. And for the most part, the knowledge that we're talking about here is conceptual. So you have Keter, Chokmah, and Bina. Chokmah is wisdom. Bina is understanding. Knowledge is the fabrication of an equivalent. It's an approximation of the wisdom and understanding that are encountered by the mind. So conceptuality is something that mystics have to be very aware of the limitations of. Because when we're making a conceptual approximation of something, we're summing it up for ourselves artificially. Like, for example, I'm sitting here talking to you now. That's a living experience. But if I think about that experience after the fact, I form a mental construct of it. I remake it for myself with linguistic labels and memories. And between memory and approximation, my version of what I think just happened to me is not exactly accurate. It's always reduced to a smaller package. So to experience the whole world this way, I mean, that's what our senses are doing. Our senses and our mind are apprehending reality through this intermediary of what we conceptually think is happening to us. Our conceptualized version of reality has to be, by necessity, extremely limited. Because otherwise, our mind will explode. You can't summarize for your mind all of the data around you. You have to pick and choose what aspects. I mean, just think about how color works. Light reflects in various frequencies according to how your nervous system is going to interpret those frequencies when they reflect back to you. The things that you think have those colors are just vibratory reflections that your nervous system can interpret. Those colors are produced in the way that you experience them by you. So we don't know reality. We know our interpretation of it. That's the sphera of dot. That's our knowledge of what we think is real or what we think is not real. So in these trees on the right, you have a tree with dot and you have a tree without dot. And when dot is not there, the whole structure of the tree changes. So you have a direct, immediate, what I call a lightning flash of gnosis. That's the tree on the right. And then you have a tree that involves conceptuality where you have the way that information is put together by human beings normally. And it's not like one is better than the other, one is right and the other is wrong. They work together. So what is stated is, this is mentioned in Genesis. These are the two trees of the Garden of Eden, the tree of life, the Etz Chaim, and the tree of the knowledge, dot, of good and evil, right? You eat the fruit of one, you get one result. You eat the fruit of the other. Well, they never got a chance to eat the fruit of the tree of life in the Genesis story. They only ate the fruit of the tree of conceptuality, which produces what we have now. That's the point of the whole thing. But what is stated in esoteric terms is that both trees share a single root beneath the ground. And that root is the non-dual essence that provides both opportunities. That's what I am representing in this image on the left-hand side of the screen here. The single root of both trees.
That is so deeply worthy of contemplation, esoteric cartographical contemplation. I love that unity. I just really appreciate you sharing how you look at that, and also looking at the esoteric cartographical meanings that are embedded in texts going back thousands of years. And I think that one of the things that's always deeply impressed me, Dave, among so many others, is this kind of total multi-layered, multi-platformed expression, as you say, kind of a coalescence into notation. And I think that that is also seen here in this image. Can you tell us, I mean, there's so much going on. There's so many beautiful nodes and octaves and resonances here. What are we looking at here? What is this about?
Well, this is an image called the dream membrane. And without getting into an explanation of that title, you could see right away that the structure of this image is the structure of what I just said. You have two biomorphic configurations in the center of it, which are like the two trees, and they're talking to each other. They're interwoven with each other. And the whole structure of the whole thing takes on the architecture of the Sphirot. What's on the right-hand side, what's on the left-hand side, what's in the middle, just like the tree works. But the whole thing is an etheric presentation that is alive, that is breathing through varying states of solidity, going from hard solidity, meaning forms that look like forms in space that have substance, to gaseous and liquid and atmospheric forms that open up into nothing. So the full range is analogous to the mind. What happens when the mind has a perception that it thinks is real? Well, we have, I see that, it's over there in this moment of now. What happens to that moment of now of perception 2 minutes later? It dissipates into the fog of the mind's associative networks. So we're always coagulating and dissolving thoughts and feelings and perceptions into the ether that is the mind itself. And what we're seeing here, given the technical structure of a Kabbalistic diagram, is an immersion into that process. The skin of that presentation is what the dream membrane is, the visionary membrane of perception, which has no distinct inner and outer parts. From the mystical perspective, we're calling into question the subject of perception, the perceiver, which you think is you, and that which is being perceived, which are all the objects in their realms that you think exist without you. And this even happens in your own mind. I mean, we do this with our own thoughts. I can think a thought as if I am a perceiver separate from the thought that I'm thinking. It's the object, I'm the subject. So the whole of mysticism is based on making these two ends of the spectrum transparent to each other. So something that is neither subject nor object can shine through. And that's the divine. That's in Kabbalah what we call the Or Ein Sof, the essence of all reality, the root of both trees.
And what I love, among many other things, is your shattering of what could be considered like a classic Gnostic view of this, where there's this effectively false binary between matter and spirit. And I really think that this is shown so powerfully in the next image, where you explore open possibility and mirror-like presentation. So can you tell us a little bit about what's going on here in terms of shattering the false dichotomy or the duality that people might have?
Well, this is basically a regular tree diagram seen through the lens of my own interests. And this false dualistic dichotomy that you're talking about is just how presentation works. Presentation works because of contrasts. Without contrasts, we wouldn't perceive anything at all. So the fact that there is a non-dual essence that presents itself dualistically is the paradox of life. So realizing that paradox at its root, the heart of the matter, is the idea that it is beyond contrasts, but presents itself as in the garment of contrasts. And those contrasts really come down to yes and no, something and nothing, being and non-being. But the essence is beyond either of those two extremes. The essence can't be reduced to a state of being or the absence of it. So what we see on the left here is my tree diagram. And this screen that you're looking at here, just in its totality, is how I explain these things. I usually have on one side of the screen one of my esoteric cartographic images in its fullness, which you see on the right-hand side, which allows that living quality to spill forth, and in the process becomes a vision. If you want to explain it and study it, you really have to delineate its parts technically, and that's the line diagram to the left. So when it comes to these line diagrams, that's what I prefer to talk about to make my technical points. The diagram on the right, I prefer not to use those to explain what I'm talking about with, because they should explain themselves. They're alive. They speak for themselves. So these are like two different vocabularies. A vocabulary which comes out of my own notes. And I carry around in my pocket these cards because I don't use notebooks anymore. I use separate cards. And I have my pencils and pens. I have my note cards. And if you're going to serve this work, it's 24 hours a day. You know, like there is never a time when I'm not engaged in esoteric cartography. Constantly looking at my notes, making more notes, and then I make composites of notes. And those are the line diagrams that serve as the basis for the explorations in the pictures like we see on the right-hand side of the screen. So the fully developed pictures and the notes are separate vocabularies that are connected.
And you mentioned earlier to that very point about the kind of skeletal structure and this kind of living organic expression. You mentioned the Triptychs earlier and this kind of medieval presentation and the very, very important distinction between art and contemplative mysticism and contemplative cartography as a living practice. And I think in terms of the triptych, can you tell us, Dave, like what are we looking at here? Because the skeletal structure that you so often wonderfully employ is not present, but instead we're looking at a triptych that is so, I mean, the living organ, organic, just malleability and pervasiveness is everywhere here. What are we looking at here?
Well, there are all of these vocabularies that are interwoven with each other. We have Kabbalistic elements, alchemical elements, biomorphic elements, etheric elements. It is sort of a living temple, like I said, where the quality of its life is evoked magically from the act of drawing. And what happens when I'm drawing is that I open myself up to the impressions from my contemplative practice, my mystical practice. And it's not that I'm illustrating those impressions, because I don't think you can do that. You would never reach there's no way to make those impressions sit on a piece of paper by making marks on the paper. It can't happen. But what you can do is take your mind out of the process and call to the ethers for what is impressed upon you in those contemplative sensations to spill forth into the materials and live there. It's a magical evocation of a type that what you are really doing is getting out of the way and calling forth a presence of the ethers to inhabit the drawing materials and the structures, because you're giving it a home where it can feel comfortable. And you are not in control of this process. I'm not in control of this process at all. But if you look at this image, you see that the entire thing has the structure of the Sphirot in every part of it. So the architecture of it, it's like you're building a house, and then you're saying to the presence of the ethers, come live in this house. And either it works or it doesn't. And if it didn't work, you wouldn't be looking at a drawing. I mean, it would be just like it would be a failure. But if it does work, if you get something, if I get something from this process, I didn't put it there. I didn't make it. This was not an idea in my mind that I thought of and then made. I can't take credit. I mean, obviously, on one level, I can take credit. I drew this somehow, but I don't know how. As a matter of fact, I figured out very early on that I really shouldn't look into that issue too deeply and should just be astonished by it and get out of the way. Because the minute I start taking ownership of it, I become an artist. Like this is some form of personal expression. And that just doesn't sit well with being a contemplative mystic at all. So I prefer, at least for myself, I don't know what other people think, I have no idea, but I prefer for myself to look at a drawing like this as just something that happened.
I absolutely appreciate that. Again, going back to Blake talking about how he has passages in Jerusalem and the Four Zoas and otherwise about how his friends don't understand him, how he literally just goes off, isolates, and he invokes to be inhabited by, I mean, effectively having it literally, there's a passage like, have this come through my right hand as I write or as I draw on the illuminated page. And I see that with exactly what you're doing on just a completely beautiful, contemplative, mystical level. And I think, Dave, what you opened with our discussion today is how you started and looking at the historical elements, the historical manuscripts, the source work. And you also touched on somebody who you said we would get to now in this next image, which is Robert Flood. And I would love for you to tell us a little bit about, this is 400 years ago. There's a diagram on the left, and then there's your diagram on the right. What are we looking at here?
Well, the diagram from Flood from his History of the Macrocosms from 1617. And in the 17th century, you had what we know in the Western esoteric tradition as all of the elements of Hermetic Kabbalah and alchemy, and ultimately what became Rosicrucianism, coming out of Europe, having passed through the Renaissance. And Flood in England had his images engraved by the great studio of Marion and de Bry, who made basically almost all of the classic alchemical books that you can think of from the 17th century. Marion and de Bry engraved almost all of them. So Flood was not an artist. He probably made sketches that are gone and passed them to these fantastic engravers. And in the process of being engraved, I'm sure that they inserted things that weren't there in his original drawings. I think that they would have to. So what you get are works that are just absolutely exquisite that come from an esoteric cartographer's notes. And that's what we're looking at here. It's a team effort, you could say. It's not the personal expression of an artist. All right. Now, when you're looking at what he's representing here, it's essentially the dynamics of the tree outside of the Jewish tradition completely. That you have a source, which was his God, going through a process of entering into the mirror-like relationship of contrasts. And I don't share the view of Robert Flood. He was much more of a Gnostic dualist than I am. I'm much more on the non-dual side. But it doesn't matter. It's the logic of these diagrams that I'm interested in, not necessarily the statements. Because when I read History of the Macrocosm, I find things I agree with and things I don't agree with. It doesn't really matter that the pictures have an internal logic in the way that they're constructed that is, I feel kinship with. Like I represent these principles the same way. Now, when I was a kid and I didn't have these texts available to me, I saw Robert Flood's images and I didn't know what they were. I was looking at them before I knew what they were. So something about the way that the pictures were constructed affected me when I was, 10 years old, and I saw grainy, horrible, blurry looking versions of them in badly made books, because they were used as illustrations for, plates and books of other things, like psychology books would have a flood image in them, unexplained, or a Jungian book or something like that. And it's a system of checks and balances that has the logic of the Kabbalistic tradition. And it grew up at the same time that alchemy grew up in the post-Renaissance Hermetic sense. So I look at that. I mean, this is one of my great influences for my visual vocabulary, Robert Flood. So what you see on the right here is an image of mine, and I don't want to talk about how this image and Flood's image connect, because it's sort of beyond the scope of the mechanics of the diagram, how they're connected. It's a logical way of constructing a visual vocabulary, right? It's the structural mechanics that are shared, where we live in the same register. So I deeply, deeply love Robert Flood's images for that reason. 1617, History of the Macrocosm. And if you go to the next image, I'll give you one of my other great influences. This is an exquisite image engraved by an engraver. I don't think it was Marion and Zabrai who engraved this one. Designed by the great maker of diagrams, the great esoteric cartographer, Dionysius Andreas Freiherr, from the early 18th century. And what Freiherr did was map out the mystical explorations of Jacob Boehme. So Boehme was his authority, you could say. So he was functioning not as an explorer. And I do think Flood was much more of an explorer than Freiherr was in that sense, and on his own in that sense. But Freiherr had Boehme to anchor his ideas. But he went way past those ideas into his own ideas. So he did do explorations based off of it. And what we're looking at here is something that for most people looking at it would be completely incomprehensible, but it does show things that are really recognizable. Astrological references, spheres of activity that are connecting, where you get dimensions of reality expressed by those spheres. And in their conjunction, we see that certain connections are possible. On the right is one of my diagrams that I feel shares a kind of structural architecture with this vocabulary. Dionysius Freiherr absolutely has always been one of my great influences, along with Flood in that sense, because nobody makes diagrams like this. There's only a handful of people in the history of humanity who made pictures like this. And this was my model. When you want to be an esoteric cartographer, you don't have a lot of role models, but these two guys were definitely that for me.
And that's what I think is so amazing about your work. And I think it's an invitation for all of us to explore contemplative mysticism and really bathe in that is, you talk about this constant, living, malleable, beautiful, constantly dynamic way of realizing reality. And I think that what you do too so amazingly is take what you discover, what you find, and you also connect it to these historical sources. So we're in the 18th century into
very early 18th century.
Yes. And then going to the 1700s here, which again, early, staying in that same early 18th century. Can you tell us, again, going back to this theme about the tree and the Sephiroth, what is going on here? What are we looking at?
Well, this is an excerpt of an Ilan diagram. Ilan means tree. In the Jewish world, you have shavisis, like I said, and these Ilan diagrams, which are technical diagrams that explain the Kabbalistic system. And they're not made as standalone pieces for a wall, and generally not made for books. They're rolled up into scrolls. And the scrolls are usually kind of narrow and very, very long, like possibly 20 feet long. And then they're rolled up and put in a metal container of some sort. And as opposed to a drawing that's done on paper, they're done on parchment. And parchment is animal skin. So that's what a Torah scroll is made of by a Jewish scribe. So obviously they're held to a standard of sacredness to be put on the Torah parchment substance in a way that's very different from an image on paper, right? They're sacred images, but they're completely esoteric. So this is a little section of one, and it shows one of the cornerstones of my system. We have the 10 Sefirot, the tree of life here on the Lurianic tree from 1700. So you're barely out of the 1600s here, right? So really what we're talking about was still in that 17th century magical time of esoterica in the West. And what we have here is 9 spheres of activity, 9 seals above the tree of life. Now, what was intended here is very different than what I intended in my image on the right, which has the same configuration. In my image on the right, you have the tree of life with the 9 spheres above it as well. But I mean something very different than the author of this scroll meant, but the form is the same. So what I took from that form relates to a very obscure passage that has meant a tremendous amount to me in the Zohar. Zohar, first part, section 65, subsection A. Zohar 165a, where it explains how what is raised alchemically from Malkut and then into the lower portion of Yetzirah, and then into the upper portion of Yetzirah, and then into the supernal register where dot hovers. That aspect of dot, which causes us to make approximations, is sent into the root of Keter to collapse and destroy conceptuality into a non-conceptual gnosis. And what the Zohar says is in the collapsing of the conceptuality of dot for the most part, and I'm paraphrasing based on commentaries from Rebbe Nachman of Breslov here, in the collapsing of dot, 9 chambers are created in which gnosis is realized. So the 9 chambers above the tree come from the restrictions of Keter disintegrating. And in my system, I explore the primordial essential qualities of reality through those 9 chambers. So here I have a predicate for the form in this Lurianic tree from 1700, but what I'm doing with it in my diagram is completely different, where I'm exploring non-dual virtues in a totally new way. And you see elements of the ethers and the biomorphism in various registers in my image as well, because my diagram is alive. The Lurianic diagram is merely a technical diagram in relation to it.
Oh, that's incredible. And in that collapsing of that apprehendistic dot, 9 spheres emerge that are needed for the apprehension of the realization of reality. I'm wondering in this next image, because you talked about the scrolls. Yeah, is this a similar thing where you have a very technical kind of diagram or an expression, and you took something different from this? Can you share about about this?
I'm friends with a guy named Yossi Chayes. He's probably in academia and in scholarship, he's probably the world's greatest authority on Kabbalistic diagrams, and he lives in Israel. And there's one Ilan diagram, tree diagram, that he says that nobody in the academic world, no scholar, has been able to crack. It's a totally mysterious diagram, and it's thin and narrow, but it's over 20 feet long. And what I'm showing on the screen on the left-hand side here is sections of this diagram, which is from the late 18th century, the 1700s, right? Roughly contemporary, probably, with the founding of the United States around the same time. So in this mysterious diagram, a certain kind of geometry is expressed, a certain geometric inquiry that takes for its basis a certain set of geometric intervals that I recognize in my exploration of the 9 chambers. And the basis of the form, or the starting point, we could say, will be familiar to Western esotericists as the magic square of Saturn. Because Saturn is the principle of limitation. Saturn is the principle of reduction to specific forms, right? And that's necessary in the making of containers and constructs that can be summed up, that have an inside and an outside, that set boundaries. So the 9 chambers are an exploration in what is boundless and infinite, but it always assumes the form of the finite. The infinite is everything, but the finite that we perceive directly is its mode of expression. So that paradox is what the 9 chambers are all about. And what I have on the right-hand side of the screen here are some of my seals, because part of the cartographic exploration that will be of interest to your audience that I do is the making of seals, magical seals, that literally seal a mode of inquiry, literally seal something that I'm exploring when it's evoked that could be summed up and held by the mind. You could visualize it. You could contemplate it. You could do many, many things with these seals. And that's why I have different types of seals for different functions. So on the top of the right-hand portion of the screen here, you have the magic square of Saturn with the attributes of the 9 chambers, and then the geometry of how that relates to a construct that is as important to me as the tree itself, the construct of the quadrisected circle, the squared circle, where you have 4 intervals that present the cardinal directions, right? Infinity, east, west, north, south, with a center point, and that's 4 around me, and I'm in the center of the temple. That's the 5th. So the interval between the 4 and the 5 and the 9 is exactly what is being explored in this Ilan diagram, this mysterious diagram from the late 18th century that's now in the Israel Museum. And nobody in academia understands it, and they won't touch it. But I look at this, and I remember I told Yossi, I don't understand what they were doing when they made this diagram, but I know what I can do with it. So for me, it's accessible. It doesn't mean I knew its original use, because I don't, and I don't care. But I look at it and I see my own exploration in it. Like I can talk to it and it talks back.
That's incredible. And what I love, among many other things, is the use of symbolism and the decrypting and simultaneous encrypting of meaning and practice and realization, all embedded in an image that one can contemplate in front of, engage with. And I think that this absolutely is expressed here in this.
Oh, wait, before
image.
we go to the next image.
Yes, absolutely.
Let me make one final comment about this. I found this particular Ilan diagram after I had started to work this way. So it's not that I discovered these intervals to work with through this diagram. It was already completely developed, and then I found this diagram fairly late in my life. And the minute I saw it, I recognized, oh, well, I know what that is. Which is very different than the other images that we've looked at today, where they were with me my whole life, and I sort of came upon my own way of working from knowing what flood was like and what Freyher was like, and seeing even Shavisi diagrams and Ilan diagrams, but not this one. I didn't have this as a resource when I was constructing my visual vocabulary. I constructed the visual vocabulary and then found it. And then, boom, confirmation that this was a form of cartography that someone else lived in other than me.
Which is such a beautiful confirmation of this one reality, but the expression in almost these like infinite bejeweled facets, and how would one person, one practitioner, one explorer, one esoteric cartographer, one contemplative mystic sees that in another. Just what a beautiful octaval resonance there. And one of the things too, Dave, is in these images and in the symbolism that you lay out, either the skeletal symbolism, the organic symbolism, the marriage of heaven and hell, if you will, the unity of the two trees, is you also have just a beautiful, and I think it's expressed in this image as well. And I'd love for you to tell us what's going on here, because, for instance, right at almost in the curvature at the top, a shining darkness enshrouds the mirror of exchanges beyond qualities. Can you tell us about what are we looking at here?
A shining darkness enshrouds the mirror of exchanges is the mind in its mode of operation. That the mind without content, there's nothing to see. It's dark to itself, but it shines by virtue of the fact that it's a vehicle for perceptibility. So the mind is inherently dark, but expresses itself as light. It is that paradox of a luminous darkness and a dark luminosity. And it functions like a mirror, because a mirror has no image of its own, right? It's open, but it reflects anything and everything, just like the mind. So what that line that you're asking about is direct relevance to consciousness. And this is part of a series of images that I did on a big scale where 9 images fit together, and each of the images has 2 parts. The part on the right here is exactly what I just said about the spherode and the 9 chambers. And you see a sort of a tree diagram that go up through the registers with the 9 chambers on top with that hand, that outstretched hand. So it's just what the Zohar is talking about, where something is raised out of concealment into realization, and the 9 chambers bear forth the meaning and fullness of that realization of its primordiality, we could say. That's on the right-hand side. The complements on the left-hand side are the stages in which the mind contemplates. And what we have here is a delineation of the contemplative process as a ladder, a set of stages where we go from, stupidity and ignorance into increasing the depth of meaning. So if you go to the next image, this is the larger piece, and what we just saw is the upper right-hand image from this composite. So rather than a triptych, which is just 3 images, we have 9 images, but each image has a right-hand panel, a left-hand panel, and a center panel, except for the center one. So what we have here is each image of the 9 is a triptych, we could say.
That is incredible, and is what we're looking at here resonant to what we discussed earlier about, you mentioned the kind of 9-celled square of Saturn, but you also mentioned that the collapsing of Dot, right?
Yeah.
inaugurates these 9 spheres. Can you tell us a little bit about the relationship between the square, the 9, and the collapsing of dot in this case as well? Is that all encrypted in this image?
Yeah, one of the things about the 9 chambers is that we have in the magic square of Saturn, for example, 8 intervals surrounding a center. The center would be the 9th. And that center is really, really important. And in the geometry that I explored that goes back to that Elon diagram, you can make a circle out of that square where you have an 8-fold circle, which is sort of the cardinal points and the in-between points, right? The points in between the cardinal directions. And they revolve around the heart of the field. So just like in the last image that you saw, where you had the 9 chambers, in the middle was the outstretched hand, that middle is not arbitrary. That's the heart of the process. And all the symbolism uses that compositional structure, all of it, including, like you just alluded to, the construction of the composite narrative. It all works off of the same principles of interval symbolism.
This is incredible. These visions and revisions, the kind of nautilik, embedded meaning and contemplative mirroring that is within these beautifully woven. I mean, it's so hard to English this, but I very much appreciate you sharing it. And this, Dave, leads to something you discussed earlier, which has been a theme throughout this conversation, is so many listeners might be familiar with classic esoteric symbols like circles, for example. And you say that there is a deep relationship, and I think it's reflected in this image, on your practice, contemplative mysticism, hidden, encrypted, embedded symbolisms and ways of engaging and apprehending and expressing reality, and classic esoteric symbols. So what are we looking at here? And how does this relate to your practice?
Well, what we're going to look at now are various perspectives on the making of magical seals. And magical seals, like the seals in the grimoires that a lot of your audience uses, that's a form of esoteric cartography. That's a form of the graphic mapping of etheric exploration. And magic is just a way to draw that exploration into the flesh, we could say. Whether that flesh is a mental flesh or a physical flesh, it doesn't matter. It's basically an engagement of the hidden with the revealed, or the process of revealing, we could say. So the cartographic seals that work with the intervals that I'm talking about, like the 8 and the 9 and the 5 and the 4 that I referred to, should be familiar to every single person who listens to your show. And if you look at the lower left hand symbol, that's the basis of Solomonic magic right there. I mean, you've seen that a million times, right?
Absolutely.
Well, that diagram is based on a circle and the quadrants and the center of the circle as its machine. And what is produced in the triangle is a result of what that machine does. Yeah? So that semiotic architecture is in everything in these esoteric traditions. Like, for example, on the upper left, an image from George Ripley, like from the Ripley Scrolls, from his 12 Gates from 1591. It's the exact same construction of circles, a quadrisected circle, basically, the quadrants, and a circle binding it into the wholeness of a single field. But what interests me most of all about that Ripley diagram is what's happening in the center of it, where you have 4 circles converging into each other, touching each other. At that touch point, something really extraordinary happens, because the quadrants are our image of infinite space What happens when the dynamic of infinite space that we see directionally coalesces into a non-directional, atemporal, non-conceptual, insubstantial moment of realization beyond the calibration of any limitations, such as the limitations of what's in front of me, what's to the right, what's to the left, what's behind me. What happens when that infinite expanse, which is expressed as the quadrants, becomes something that outshines the quadrants? That's the heart of the matter. And that's what we see in the center of the diagram. Same thing with the image on the upper right here, which is an image from John Dee, from True and Faithful Relation. Those are the watchtowers, the quadrants. That's a quadrisected circle. Same thing. That's from 1559. Everybody knows that image, just like everybody knows the Solomonic image, in your audience, I should say. So this is the basis for a discussion of how esoteric cartography works graphically in seals, speaking the language that your audience will, it doesn't have to be explained to your people. On the lower right is one of my diagrams. And the reason I have it there is because it fits in the family of the others. So if you understand everything I just said, you know what I'm doing in that image. Why I made it and how I made it, that's a different story. We're just talking here about the function of how it's constructed.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that this goes, Dave, to, you know, these circles, these, as you mentioned, circle, triangle, these are engines, as you say, of creating that realization, not even creating or making something happen, but just to realize the always present exchange and fluidity that's there. And you take this, let me go to the next image here, to another level as well. So tell us what's going on here, because there's so much that is just jumping out to me in this image.
Well, because what I'm exploring is primordiality itself, right? The essentiality of phenomena itself. My quadrisected circles always go back to the 9-chambered structure, which is beyond Keter, we could say, in having its roots in the Or Ein Sof. So all of these interval families of symbolism, when they start mixing with each other for various reasons and various types of exploration, once you know what they are, once you know the sacred geometry language that I'm working with here, you could read the structure of these diagrams and draw conclusions from how that structure is used. So the left-hand side of the tree are different seals that I've made using that language. And each one of them does a different thing for a different reason. On the right-hand side, you basically have the same type of diagram that John Dee gave us, where it's basically quadrisected space in a circle of work. You know, once you know that, the rest of it people can figure out quite easily. But, you know, sometimes it's not so easy. Sometimes I've done these things and it's not quite clear what they're used for. But the function of the architecture, I want people to really understand that language and how it works, because once you see it, you'll realize that this is part of a tradition that's been around since the ancient world, and every occultist is using it.
That's one of the most impressive things. I mean, everything we're discussing is amazing, is the octaves, the resonance across space-time, across many different areas of the world, countries, and you're kind of bringing this all together. Okay, so you mentioned just now the function of the architecture, and I'm very curious to that very point about this architecture, because we have swords, we have this kind of penetrative aspect, this kind of connecting on the central trunk of the tree. There's so many things going on here. So tell us about the function of the architecture of this image. What's going on here?
Well, this is where languages of symbols that are associated with magical processes and mystical aspirations really come together and start talking to each other. Each one has its theater of operation, but the theaters are overlapping. And then you got to ask yourself, well, if I'm using these symbols, what am I talking about? Well, a sword is what cuts through. And what does it cut through? It cuts through the sphere of limitation that entraps the mind's freedom. So obviously a sword penetrating a circle or a sword cutting through evokes an idea of establishing a path to freedom from limitations and restrictions. And there's various registers in which this can function. One particular register that I talk about all the time is that the sword that cuts through actually contains an arrow. And the arrow, once the sword has cut through its restraints, can be released. And then the arrow is released into the freedom of the expanse of the sky. And the expanse of the sky, which is our own mind. It's very interesting because both the sword and the arrow are the mind of the sky that ultimately we discover that we're flying through. And ultimately the arrow and the expanse of the sky become the same. That which flies and that which is flown through are synonymous with each other. And the arrow disappears to become the sky. And that's what's being represented here. In between the two swords is the Shavisi diagram with tons of Kabbalistic references to certain practices, we should say, certain internal practices. And above what we have are seals associated with the mystical process using the internal organ system of the body as symbols for different types of transformation. We have the intestines, which draw forth nutrients. We have the kidneys that purify. We have the lungs that exchange the etheric medium we've been speaking about, and the heart, which is part of that cardiopulmonary exchange of the ethers, and the brain, which makes distinctions. So there are many, many registers in which this fivefold organ system is used in my work, but ultimately one particularly important vantage point for the expression of that five organ system is expressed by the seal on the right of the five organs, and that's through the eyes, where there is the central channel of the human body, and it goes directly through the eyes into vision, where that which sees and that which is seen become like the arrow to the sky, where the arrow becomes the expanse through which it flies. The same thing happens with vision and our sense of the body-mind, that ultimately our sense of consciousness and the vision of what is seen through the eyes. And the eyes are a little different than the other senses because the making of a vision is special, right? And ultimately it's the arrow dissolving to the sky. That's what happens through the physical eyeballs. And we have a seal that shows that. And it also has Kabbalistic correspondences because the central channel of that seal is the middle pillar of the tree. And that's where the sword stands in the seal on the right, that big one, where it cuts through spheres of activity. There are three of them here that pose registers of limitation. So you have a whole mystical and magical agenda being explored by these seals in a very different way than it is in my pictures.
And you're not making an image. You're not making something happen. You're not forging together pieces of reality into a nice, comfortable, esoteric, cartographical position. And correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, but one of the themes through all of these images and the sword cutting through the sphere of limitation is not to forge kind of this artificial comfortable construct of reality that allows you to go through your day-to-day life. It's about cutting through limitations so that you realize things as they already always are the case.
It's the opposite of building something. I'm getting out of the way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, it's one thing to build something as an edifice, like a structure or mechanical process. The mechanical process here is my erasing of myself, so that what is, like you said, already inherently the case will shine forth, unencumbered by my thinking that I'm this little person having this little experience.
Right, exactly. Yes. And to that very point, one of the things that's been a theme is this in your work, and just in sharing even verbally here, is this kind of infiniteness. One of the ways that you express that is this folding within, taking an entire image and its own mechanics, folding it within another larger image. And I think on this next image here, I'd love to get your thoughts, because here I see so many touch points, this kind of heart organistic folding into a larger structure of spheres and specific ways of engaging. So what's going on here?
Okay, these are seals with a very different emphasis than the ones that I've previously shown, where we have references to specific parts of the Kabbalistic system. In particular, the inquiry into the symbolism of the primordial Tzimtzum contraction, which, if taken literally, becomes kind of like a Big Bang event. This is the way that Kabbalah approaches the primordial origin of phenomena and the creation of the universe. But since I am not a theist or a religious person of any kind, I don't believe in a beginning point of creation like a Big Bang would assert. And moreover, I don't believe in a creator or a thing that was created, or even a creative process in the linear step and stage progression of hierarchy. Because to me, phenomena is spontaneously revealed in its wholeness all the time, outside of the memory of dot, outside of past, present, and future. So when I explore the incredibly rich and profound symbolism of the Tzimtzum, what I'm exploring is the basic paradox of phenomena. The essence of reality is infinite, but it presents itself in finite form. Well, that's the circle of the Tzimtzum. The circle appears to have an inside and an outside. It appears to contain something, which is all of reality. But what about what's beyond the circle? Well, ultimately, there has to be a transparency between containment and the uncontainable to really understand the mystical agenda at all. And this is what the alchemy that I'm working with is all about, extracting the essence of that paradox. So we see images on the top here, a seal that illustrates, we could say, the Tzimtzum in various ways. An alchemical seal using that same symbolism on the lower left-hand part of the screen, elaborated fully Kabbalistically into the three worlds of Bria, Yetzirah, Seiah on the lower right-hand portion. And the image on the right-hand side of the screen, I've already explained quite a bit. It's a quadrisected circle, just like John Dee was using. But in the center of that quadrisected circle is a biomorphic structure that's growing out of the triple world.
And you just to follow up on that, and I think this is reflected in the next image, you mentioned alchemically extracting the essence of the paradox. And when I think of classical, as you said, kind of Renaissance, post-Renaissance alchemy, I think of the symbolism of distillation and beakers and things like that. And I think in this next image, I'm getting so many feeling tones here of this kind of this distillation process. I mean, what is going on in this specific image?
various seals that explain stages of the unfolding of realization in the form of alchemical breakthroughs, we could say, where the vessel, which is ultimately perception, is negotiating the dynamic energies of its own capacity to perceive and coming up against its resistances. And we unfold our resistances in steps and stages. Most of us don't just snap our fingers and we have complete gnosis. Most of us have to work through some stuff. That's what alchemy maps out. The cartography of alchemy is a mapping out of our struggle against internal resistances. And we have various stages of that being expressed on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, there's a central dynamic here, which goes back to that Kabbalistic diagram of the two trees, one with dot, one without dot, that ultimately they have to work together because we're not throwing away our experience of the world, right? We're not throwing our experience of the mind away either. We have to think and feel, right? So a tree can be seen causally as having a source and a destination. Most people see the tree in a very linear way, that it starts at Keter and is expressed in Malkut. But if you hold a view beyond the beginnings and ends of things, if you hold a view that is nonlinear, that is beyond the segmentation of limited bits that or fragments that are pieced together like the mind wants to do, Keter and Malkut have a very different relationship to each other. Malkut is the display. Keter is ultimately the root of that display, but they share an equalization. So not only is there an equalization between Keter and Malkut, but there's an equalization both from the perspective of conceptuality, the tree on the left, and non-conceptual breakthrough, the tree on the right. And in the center of the diagram on the right-hand side, you see alchemical vessels that are like those two trees, where the Keter of one is talking directly to the Malkut of the other, and they're interchanging, exchanging with each other so that true non-duality can come even out of dualistic thought.
Woo! Wow, that is, again, listeners, I hope, in addition to, of course, checking out the links below for all of Dave's writings and website and classes and everything else, I really hope that you'll listen and re-listen to this, because that is such a profound point of the beautiful perfection of exchange and direct talking to one another, and how that, to me at least, that really does tend to, in the opposites, there's unity. It's but without duality. That's what's so beautiful about it to me, is there's this,
but even though duality appears, just as you said, there's infinity, but presenting itself in finite forms. It's absolutely wonderful. Yeah, that's the amazing thing, is that the non-dual presents itself dualistically, and to become concerned with the non-dual can't ignore duality, because to choose non-duality over duality is itself dualistic.
Exactly. Yeah, right. I am only going to be totally non-dual.
Yeah.
Okay. Now what you're doing, now you're petrifying yourself in the non-dual duality. It's
plenty of people make that mistake. And it's funny, because the thing about somebody who chooses non-duality over duality is they tend to get very pompous about it.
Right.
And take themselves really seriously, like, oh, here, I'm going to tell you the great secret. The great secret is the non-dual. And then they get this expression on their face and they act in this certain way. You see a lot of New Agers, Advaitins doing this. And if you have an aversion to spiritual bullshit and you watch people behaving in this way, it's like there's nothing more disturbing. It's like so bad. It's so bad.
So bad. It's performative. It's trying to speak to someone's base. It is, I think, ego gratifying. It is just trying to present like
Well, what they want to do, these people, is they want to be a spiritual authority.
Right. Exactly. They want people to come to them and really, and for all of the secrets of the universe in a very solemn and this kind of taking yourself seriously. I think it kind of like, exactly, it speaks to more about their own very limited mindset than it does about the actual potential of any of the material that's being discussed.
Many people will argue that you need a spiritual authority that has realized wisdom in order to pass it to you. Where someone might say, I attach to my spiritual authority, my source of wisdom, because it's alive and a certain realizer has realized it, so I attach to them. I'm not even criticizing that way of working. I'm just basically saying that I'm doing something else. I'm an explorer who is discovering. I am not claiming anything or attaching to someone else's claim, either of a person or a tradition. I am simply sticking my head in there and seeing what I see and mapping out what I map out, so people can use my work in any way that they want if they find it valuable. And I put out my books and I put out my information to divorce myself from these other ways of working that have nothing to do with me, but that I derive sustenance from. So it's a unique position in the scheme of things and a privilege to live in a time when I can do this, and publish my book, and people buy the books. So obviously they're using it for something, but it's none of my business what they're using it for, because I'm not offering a path. I'm not saying follow me.
Exactly. You're becoming a channel for the work. It's moving through you, it's expressing, and you're letting the work, who is the boss, as you say, speak for itself.
Hell yeah. And that's all that I'm doing. So if it's misinterpreted for offering a system for people to follow, that would be incorrect.
Right. And one of the ways I think that is really refreshing, and I think to your very point, Dave, it's something any of us could do working with your material is, and we'll look at this in the next image, taking existing historical esoteric works and using seals to interpret these works. And so we're going to go to the year 1678 and the Book of Lambspring. Would love to, you obviously have published on this before, but for someone listening to all of this for the first time, what is the Book of Lambspring and how are you using seals to interpret the images in the Book of Lambspring?
Book of Lambspring is an alchemical text which is much more mystically oriented than the majority of alchemical works of the 17th century tend to be, which are laboratory works. And it was published in 1678 as part of the Hermetic Museum collection of short tracts. And the images that we see, the pictorial symbolic images, were engraved by that great studio of Marion and DeBry that I mentioned that did so many of the great alchemical works that people are familiar with. But the Lambspring text goes back quite a bit earlier than the collection called the Hermetic Museum that was put out of the studio of Marion and DeBry, which was just short tracts assembled into one volume. And my interpretation of it is not definitive. It's my interpretation, right? And in my interpretation, I see it as a mystical instruction. And when you read it, it's not clear what they're talking about and what you're supposed to do. But it is so full of evocatory suggestions. And in that richness, you can do so much work, but yet it's like always on the cusp of being unspoken, what they're referring to. And I worked with it for years. And I was in retreat. I did a formal retreat for 3 years, silent retreat. And in my silent retreat, I really worked with lamp spring a lot. And a couple of years later, when I came out of retreat, I summed up all the stuff I did with it through esoteric cartography, where I took the sections, the 16 sections, and I basically made seals mapping out the dynamics of those sections in relation to each other to try to make sense of it, to explore and evoke a clearer understanding for me. And I published this with the seals and my written explanations of each section, each of the 16 sections, in a book. So to me, it's a tangential language. You get the language of the words and images of lamp spring, and then you get my seals and words commenting on it. It's commentary.
And I think such a green verdancy of invitation for all of us to explore that, working with your material, but again, in our own way, and seeing how you think about things, how the images express themselves is wonderful. And I think it's summed up as well. Let's look at this next image too, because here there is no diptych, there is no triptych, right? This is, as I look at it and try in my very limited way to contemplate it, a totality. So what is expressed in this image?
Well, the reason why I chose this particular image to talk about with you today is because it gives a really good example about how my magical seals function within a picture. Because all my pictures have these magical seals that I make within them. In a sense, you could say that the entire composition is created with the same semiotic dynamics as the seals are. But people tend to separate them. A seal is in a circle, it's isolated. All the biomorphic and etheric activity of a picture seems separate from that, but not really, because they're connected in all sorts of ways. And this picture is one of the best examples of how these elements are integrated within one another. So just the way that the picture is constructed brings together so much of what we're talking about in this conversation. And for someone who has followed us to this point in the conversation, you could see it here.
Yes. And again, I think listeners, just going back over these images and just listening back to the conversation, I hope you can pick up, and again, in my very limited way, I'm over the years, slowly picking up on these tonalities, these resonances, and the unity of these, even if it expresses itself as separate seals and forms and presentations. That is wonderful, Dave. And I think going back to the symbolism, I know many listeners, right, and you've touched on this, are familiar with the symbols like the triangle of art, which historically in Solomonic magic is a floor triangle. Here, the 3 points of the triangle have associations with, in the three corners, biomorphism, geometry, and linguistics. And then on the right side of the image, you have that, again, that living, breathing, organic expression. So what is going on here with the triangle, and why that shape? Why is it important? But also, what is the overall function of this?
Yeah, you're very perceptive in your remarks. The seal here in a triangular form is unusual for me. I usually have round seals. But what this particular seal is showing is the confluence of these strands that are woven together in my work, where, like I said, there's organic and geometric aspects that make a technical diagram come to life. That's geometry and biomorphism. When you combine those, when they become inseparably combined, you have a structured biomorphism, which is how the ethers discharge themselves, you could say. But then I have this third element of linguistics, because all of my diagrams and pictures have words in them. Why is that? Because words occupy a totally different dimension than geometry or biomorphism does. And when you inject that into it, what you have now is exactly what Freyr was doing, exactly what Flood was doing. They had words in their organic and geometric structures as well. That's what esoteric cartography needs in order to function. So in this diagram, you have these three angles converging at that point in the center, because that point is singular. That's the vision. And what we have on the right here is this incomprehensibly weird image of mine, where there's not another image that I could think of where the process comes to life in a way that is more singular than this. Because on the one hand, you look at this image on the right and it's sort of an alchemical vessel, but it's sort of a Kabbalistic diagram too. It's got internal organs and ethers, and it's a tree. It's a tree. It's an alchemical vessel. It's a Shavisi diagram. It's an Ilan diagram, but yet it comes to life like a sort of a creature of some kind. This is what is evoked through the ethers when you combine linguistics, geometry, and biomorphism, and you ask it to do whatever it wants. It becomes both sublime and monstrous. It becomes itself, as long as you get out of the way. The esoteric cartography can break loose from the rigidity of map making and enter into this territory, which comes out of a twilight of associations where no human mind goes to these places. Like, no human mind could make this image. I didn't make this image. I couldn't make this image because I don't know what it is. What happened here is the result of something overtaking my own experience and calling forth. I don't want to call it an entity because it's not a singular entity. It hasn't spoken to me. I don't even, well, I'm not even going to go there, but it's alive, you know, and that's my relationship with a lot of this stuff. Is it's more alive than I am.
And this living expression, you know, it's so interesting that, again, you get out of the way, you allow the mystical esoteric cartography to effectively pass through you and use you as that medium or that tool, that expression, and then here it is. And one of the things that you've done earlier, you were talking about the historical relationship of scrolls, for example, and looking at these, you know, the sacredness of parchment and having kind of a scrollic protection or an ensconcing of this in your practice. And I think this next image I would love for you to share with the listeners about this one, Dave, because yeah, I get, you know, talk about scroll. Like, I can imagine this as a scroll on parchment, 20 feet long and narrow strips. What is being expressed both linguistically, geometrically, biomorphically? What is going on here? Because this is just so rich and heavily encrypted with meaning. What is happening here?
Well, like I said, when I make my notes on these cards, I keep them in my pocket. I take them out and look at them throughout the day. That's the practice of esoteric cartography. Years go by, and I end up with hundreds and hundreds of these cards. So groups of the cards fit together into a larger conversation. And one thing that I do is I make composites digitally of the note material. And the style of compositing that I come up with, I refer to as the long scroll. Long because it's endless. Scroll in the sense that it's essentially just like the Kabbalistic scrolls are, where you have explorations that are meant for elaboration, different than a picture. They're meant to be orally elaborated on and talked about spontaneously in sort of transmission or teaching way. Like, I use them to to explore for myself or others. And what we're looking at on the left-hand side here is an adaptation of part of a 20-year long scroll composite that I'm going to show you. It's going to be the last image we're going to look at here. But this is an adaptation of it. It's a section of my big long scroll composite of 20 years of work for a book I did called Metatron's Ladder, where the Archangel Metatron that people are familiar with took on a very different type of meaning for me in my practice. Without getting into that whole issue, this is a slice of the work of working up to that point associated with Keter, the root of the tree, which Metatron corresponds with. And the image on the right is from a very intricate early image of mine called the Sacrificial Universe. And the hierarchy of these three spheres where you're transitioning between the sections is actually addressing the same issues as this section of the long scroll, where you're working through material to get to the Keter point, just like the Zohar suggested, where you're raising the extracted sparks from the shells that, boom, collide into Keter, which is essentially where Metatron is realized. So what's interesting about this image is you have two totally different visual vocabularies saying much the same thing.
Absolutely incredible. And yes, we're gonna talk about the kind of fruits of all 20 years in that entire scroll. But this is so lovely to see those three spheres and how they interact, again, biomorphically, but also mapped out in that symbolic skeletal structure. Yeah, it's incredible.
You got it.
And, you know, Dave, throughout this whole conversation, one of the things that you've done is look at classic esoteric symbols and applying or having this contemplative, mystical, esoteric, cartographical expression of them. One of them, I know many listeners are familiar, and you just mentioned this about having cards, and we think of tarot cards and sections and meanings in a card. And well, in this next image here, and you have a whole book on this, but I'd love for you to just share, if listeners are seeing this for the first time, these symbolic, almost lightning flash encryptions of meaning in a variety of different divisions are on this screen. What is going on here? What are we seeing here?
This is an image from a book that I published called The 32 Keys, in which at a certain stage of my own practice, I felt the necessity to sum up the entirety of the work in a system of separate glyphs. And those glyphs were printed on cards. I think they were 4x6 or something like that, and sold as a pack of cards with the book that you could use separately for contemplation. And what it is sort of an overview of the work of mystical contemplation as a system, that there comes a time when unending exploration in esoteric cartography needs some structure. And it's always this dialogue between open-ended inquiry veering into chaos and order and structuring that order. And the two have to function together, otherwise you get lost. So at this particular juncture, I took out everything that was superfluous and just concentrated on the structural dynamics of the parts as clearly as I could, and laid them out in a structural order which was as clear as I could make. So that what you had was the ability to look at every section of the parts of the overview in relation to the whole of the overview. Separate cards that you could take out of the pack and contemplate, but you could also lay them out together and see how they flowed one to the other. And I wrote a commentary on it. So this 32 keys system was made at a time when I needed to get my bearings very clear on what it was that I was doing. And I was part of this tantric community in Michigan, like I mentioned before, and I had a hut on the property of the Hermitage. And in my hut, the walls were painted matte black. And I drew the basis of all of these diagrams over the course of years on the wall in white marker and white pens of different widths, like heavy lines and fine lines. And the way that this system came about was a sort of reducing all the diagrams on the walls of my hut to very, very pared down symbols, where I worked on them over and over and over, refining them until it became tighter and tighter and tighter, and ultimately said exactly what I wanted it to say. So the origin of this was writing on the walls. That's where I worked it out, and then it became cards in my pocket. So from the walls to my pocket to the book.
From the walls to the pocket to the book. What a beautiful way. And that's such a rejuvenating and fresh, just vibrancy of energy and the ability for all of us, I think, listeners, I really hope to really imbibe these words and the symbolism.
Well, before we go on,
please,
let me say
yes.
something. The walls to the pocket to the book, that is not art. That is not art in the contemporary sense at all. I mean, when you look at contemporary art and the contemporary definition of what art is supposed to be, it ain't that.
Right. Nope. You have the symbolism, you have the encrypted meanings, the contemplative aspects, the invitation for full immersion and contemplating any particular aspect. Because taking even a small, like if I were to look at the third card from the right, and just a small piece of that, just the tip, right? Just the tip of one of the circles, that's embedded in the whole, because the finite and the infinite expresses through the finite, but you can't think that one is the only expression. There's this beautiful unity without getting caught on unity or talking about unity. And I know we talk a lot about this offline as well, but I appreciate that so much.
Well, that's why I wanted them printed on separate cards, because what I talk about in the introduction of the book is how that this becomes a system of training the mind for a certain kind of inquiry, where you spend a certain amount of time contemplating each card, a certain number of days, then you go to the next card and you make a cycle out of it, where the book presents a system and there's a systematic way to digest it, where each part can be taken separately, but it relates back to the whole.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And speaking of this holisticism that you share with us, even going all the way back to the two trees in the Garden of Eden, well, in this next image, and I'd love for your thoughts on this, we go back to, again, that organic expression, the biomorphic expression, but also the burning bush. And you say the burning bush unfurls the dream fire of pure gnosis, which is just so poetic, but also what is going on in this image? Well,
the dream fire is, in order for me to explain what that is, I have to say that, contemplation people tend to think of as an intellectual activity. So contemplation is a misleading term. People prefer the term meditation for direct mystical interface. But contemplation is better because you're not just immersing into a quietist state like people assume meditation very often is. For people, like transcendental meditation is the perfect example, which somebody once said it's the best system to use if you want to ensure that you'll be reborn as a cow. So, contemplation contemplates infinite variation, and it's alive. So there's a devotional component to all the stuff that I do, that you have to actually fall in love with reality, in the sense that it becomes a state of awe, an astonishing state of awe, and it crackles with life and vibrancy and voltage of life force. So the dream fire is the visionary fire that we fall in love with the whole of our own life force. We merge our living life blood with the life force of the vision of reality in us and around us. And when the two enter each other's spheres and merge with each other, it literally is set ablaze with luminosity. And in that burning luminosity, like the Bible says, the bush was not consumed. Reality doesn't go away. It burns, but is not consumed. So the burning bush unfurls with the dream fire, but it's not extinguished like you light a match and then you light a piece of paper, the paper burns up and there's no more piece of paper. No, the vision of reality that we're devoted to, that we fall in love with, never goes away. So what we're seeing here is an image of mine where the sphere of appearance flowers forth in all its infinite variation, but there's also a structure here. There's also a focus here. It's not random. It's not fragmented. It's not chaotic, but the force of the living force of chaos courses within its veins, right? So it's finite infinitude, That's the poetry. That's the poetic dynamic of these images.
Incredible. I mean, really, this is just what a beautiful, beautiful way of expressing the tonalities of, like, you think about the burning bush, phrases we've heard for decades if we've, been raised in a, Judeo-Christian context, and yet having this fresh, almost impossible to express dynamism. And I think, Dave, and I know we have two more images that we need to discuss. This next image, I mean, it's hard to English this, but, liquid dynamism jumping off of the page, infinite Renaissance spheres of angels pouring forth into one's mind. I don't know what to really express, but these two images here, can you please share with us what is going on? There's such a fluidity. Yes, please. Sorry.
In the Kabbalistic system, there are the Sphirot, and there's the ground of essentiality, which is the Or Ein Sof. As the Or Ein Sof becomes the tree, it's not so simple like Western occultists generally think, that you have the Or Ein Sof out there and then it comes down and becomes the tree in an emanationist way. They're actually intermediate stages referred to as the Tzach-Tzach-Ot, roughly translated as the splendors, in the primordial stages of becoming. And this is referred to in the Bible by the terms tohu and bohu. And the earth was chaos and void, right? Prior to the creation, right? So Kabbalistically, these stages of tohu and bohu can be experienced mystically, and they're beyond even the scope of Keter, right? And part of that experience, which is a very deep level of mystical experience, I could roughly approach its description with you as what we could call profuse scintillation. And profuse scintillation is approached through the Kabbalistic symbolism as the raising of sparks of divinity from the shells of appearance, right? And there is a Kabbalistic stage of primordiality that is referred to as the world of points, which is the idea that every point, and there's infinite numbers of points, right? Every point, irreducible point, in and of itself is an entire infinite universe. So you have infinite points that are infinite universes. They're infinitely big and infinitely small. And in the conflict, like once the mind's conceptual distinction between infinitely big and infinitely small is extinguished or outshined by something else, an immensity of infinite finitude, we could say, the world of points obfuscates the idea that you are a person in an expanse called a universe. And that's where profuse scintillation, which is a real thing that happens to you. And it's not exactly comfortable. And it's not exactly either unpleasant or ecstatic either. Those terms don't work anymore. And both of these images are expressions of that profuse scintillation state of the world of points. And it's funny because it happens in the world just as we know it. And it happens through love. It happens through loving the divine. And it has to be devotional. So this is part of my practice. This is part of what I've explored in my cartographic work as well.
And it happens, as you just said, right within the world as it is. There is
no other place.
There is no other place. There's no but what I love about this, and again, we've, on the show, we've discussed, the Kabbalah, emanationistic philosophies, the way that spheres are expressions of somehow different emphases or facets of the divine. But what I love about your shattering, truly shattering of the emanationistic model is there is no quest to go on because you're here and the flower of infinity and immortality is over there. It is realizing the circumferences or the infinite. I can't even remember how you just phrased it. The infinite finitudes that are expressing itself in trillions of indeterminate points that are both simultaneously the infinity, the unending, undefinable nature of reality, expressing itself as finite expressions, whether finite physical objects.
Well, if there was an over there, if there was a destination or a realm that we're going to, we would be looking for a real long time. So it better be here. Otherwise we're out of business.
Right. Exactly. Yes. It's a beautiful point. And I think that actually what you just said, it better be this close leads to this last image. And this is the result of 20 plus years, decades of all of your practice. But let's talk about, and as this is the last image here, is the scroll.
Yeah, this is the 6 foot, 20-year long scroll. Do you have the ability on your end to zoom in?
I can try.
Why don't you try and just meander about in it?
Okay. Let's see
if you can do it. And
let's see what I can do. Let me see. I'm trying to.
Yeah, and while you're figuring that out, I'll talk about it a little bit. This is a composite of note cards going all the way from the beginning of my esoteric cartography in 2006 to 2026.
Okay.
So it's 20 years of pieces, and it's put together digitally. So it could be printed, but it wasn't drawn because all the parts are on the cards. And it roughly goes from the right-hand side where in sections. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 vertical sections. So the right-hand side vertical section on the extreme right, all of that goes back to 2006. And on the left goes back to 2026. So it's 20 years of this style of note-taking, separate from the pictures. And the whole thing is 20 feet long. And I'm trying to print it out, but it's expensive and the results aren't always great. And the interesting thing about it is like every single part of it I've used for something, either in a book or in a teaching or something. Like I have worked the fuck out of every part of this.
I have no doubt this is the result. And unfortunately, I can't zoom in, but listeners, we can see if we can link to another image in the video description below.
It's so hard to resolve that issue of how you portray it with people on a computer, because once you zoom in, you completely lose the context of the whole, and it's really hard to get the resolution right. And, it's maddening. So don't even bother trying. But people are just going to look at it. They're going to see a blur.
Right. Absolutely. But
the parts are too small.
Yes. But what you're sharing here is talk about alchemy, right? This is a distillation. This is an expression of the the fruits of all of your contemplative, mystical, as you say, explorations and what you bring back in your own way. Would that be a fair way of?
Yeah, I started making this work when I was 42 years old. I am now 62 years old. This was the only truly productive part of my life, was doing this work, because I've lived for this work. Because my life up to that point was, well, let's just say I didn't have a lot to live for. So when I found this, I had something to live for. It's like redemption is a real thing that happens to a person, possibly. And if it happens to you, if you find a reason to be alive and to serve something that's truly profound, you have the greatest treasure in the universe, and you can't take credit for it. You can't say, I'm a person who received this. No, you're a servant. Your gratitude and appreciation is to serve that which is worth serving. Not I'm serving it because I like it, or I'm compelled to do so, or I'm a cog in a machine, but I'm serving it because it's a privilege to serve it. And you live like that, and you love that, and that's why you're alive. Because if it wasn't for that, I would 100% be dead from the kind of life that I've had. I have had a weird, fucked up life where I haven't exactly been the nicest guy.
Redemption and finding that, I think, is something I know for myself, and I would assume a lot of listeners, unconsciously or not, subconsciously really long for. And I think that I guess, Dave, the best question to ask you, and of course, listeners, check out the links below to all of Dave's website, works, classes, everything. But as we wrap up this conversation, Dave, I really want to ask you about those parting thoughts, a distillation of your distillation. In other words, listeners, go back, listen to this. I really hope that you contemplate the images, go back and listen. Dave, you were just touching on redemption. You were touching on so many things. What are some of those also in addition to that? I mean, it's really hard to add on to that, but what are some of those key things that you really just want people to know about?
Well, redemption, as I said, redemption's a real thing. It's not a metaphor. It's not a platitude, or a constructed thing or a fantasy. Redemption's a real thing, but you're not in control of your own redemption. You make it happen, but it is grace that is necessary for it to happen. It won't happen without your efforts, but your efforts are not producing it. So on the one hand, you have to work very hard to redeem a life, but whether it will happen or not, and how it will happen, out of your hands. Out of your hands. So you can't sit around waiting for grace to come get you, because it won't. You've got to meet it with an appropriate alchemical vessel in which it can be poured. But you don't do the pouring. It pours itself in its own way, at its own time, spontaneously. There's nothing you could do about it other than aspire to it and structure your life in relation to it. And the funny thing is, you can't know what you don't know. So you can't know that this is coming. There's a term in Hebrew called lishma, which means for its own sake. You do the work for its own sake because it's inherently good. You have no reason. There's no reason to be an esoteric cartographer. You're not doing it for whatever the conventional worldly reason would be. You're just doing it because it's inherently good, or it won't work. And based on working for something that is illogical, and for the most part, looking at it from the outside, impossible, I received the grace of having the work happen at 42 years old after a really weird life, which I'm happy to talk about. Because what do I care? I have nothing to lose. But I lived this life without a lot of meaning. And And meaning came one day and tapped me on the shoulder, and I decided to serve it. You know, and I don't take credit for it. It's the divine.
Oh, and that, listeners, I hope is a beautiful invitation for you to explore and to not be afraid to look at Dave's images, work, how you can apply it and engage with it in your own way. That profuse scintillation, raising the sparks of divinity from the shells of appearance. Please.
I should mention one comment about that. People should feel free, if they are so inclined, to use my work any way that they want. Don't steal from me. Don't make one of my images the cover of your stupid heavy metal album, please. But because we're not talking about copyright here. I mean internal work. I mean practice. I'm not talking about commercial, applications, which I don't like when people, would do that with my work. I mean, that gets me really fucking mad, actually, to tell you the truth. But internal work, a sincere practitioner who wants to work this way and adapt it, great. That's why this is not a path. That's why this is not a system that I'm disseminating as if I was a spiritual authority and I'm telling you to do these steps with my work. There are works I do where I suggest steps, like the 32 keys, where you contemplate it in a certain order and whatnot to make a certain point, because that will train your mind in a certain way. But I'm not dangling a goal at the end of it saying you will achieve such and such, which is really the promise that a spiritual authority needs a good story. And a spiritual authority needs the promise of something that you will get at the end. It's either enlightenment, or God will like you, or you'll redeem the world, you'll save everybody, and the devil won't get you, or whatever kind of crap they come up with. The story, they better have their story down. Otherwise, they're not going to fool the medieval peasants into giving their time and their money and their family and, to follow something insane.
And it's always the case that it is right here. And that's what you're sharing with us.
If you care.
If you care, the fruits of that exploration for those who are willing to seek it and apply it in their practice in any way that they see fit, I think this has been such a powerful conversation. I know I'm going to go back and listen many times. Author, esoteric cartographer, contemplative mystic, sharing about the beautiful fruits of his contemplative, esoteric contemplation. David Chaim Smith. David, thank you. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you, Alex. It was so much fun.